At the edge of your bed, with the sheets still warm around your legs and that dull weight already sitting in your chest before your feet touch the floor, you have probably called that feeling your cross, the hard season, the strained home, the private ache you keep carrying because you think holiness must feel heavy. And I want to say this carefully because I know how tender this is. I think you were handed that phrase in a way that made your soul smaller. When Jesus says, take up your cross, most people hear, accept your misery. Just brace yourself, keep quiet, and call the pressure spiritual. But the words don't sit that way if you actually listen to them. A burden is something dropped on you. This sounds like something you do, something deliberate, something with direction in it. Sit with that. The line in Matthew is tighter than we usually let it be. Deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. 3 movements, 1 breath. First, deny himself. Then, take up. Then, follow. That order matters. Because if the first move is to deny that self, the scared, grabbing, controlling part of you, then the next move cannot simply mean collapse under pain. It means something changes in position, something in you loosens, and something else begins to rise. That's why this matters so much. If you have spent years believing the cross was the ugly thing crushing your life, then you have been looking for God in the wrong direction. Downward, into strain, into clenched teeth. And maybe that is exactly why it has felt so dry. Because there is another verse, and the minute you hear it beside this one, the whole picture tilts upward. If this already feels different in your bones, stay with me and subscribe for the rest. That other verse is in John, and once you hear it slowly, the air changes a little. Jesus says, "And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men unto me." Lifted up. He could have said handed over, struck down, cast out. He did not. He used a phrase with height in it, with motion, with direction. And that matters more than people think. Because if you place that line beside the one in Matthew, the same shape starts to appear. Deny himself, then take up, then here, lifted up from the earth. You can almost feel the movement in your own chest when the words are read that way. Something heavy in you wants to slump, wants to fold inward, wants to live down low where fear keeps control. But the language around the cross keeps leaning upward. Sit with that. Now, I know the fair objection already. You might say, come on, aren't you just polishing hard words until they sound gentler? That is a fair question. And no, I'm not trying to turn the rough edge of the gospel into something soft and decorative. The scene itself stays severe. The cost stays real. But the symbol carries a direction, and the direction is part of the teaching. If he is lifted up, and that lifting draws people, then this sign is doing more than describing pain. It is showing ascent. It is pulling. That is where a lot of people miss it. They stop at the wound and never ask what the gesture is doing. They see weight, but not height. They hear sacrifice, but not rising. And once that goes missing, the whole phrase, take up your cross, starts sounding like spiritual exhaustion with holy wallpaper on it. But if the motion is upward, then you have to ask the next honest question. Up where? Because if this command is meant to be lived daily, the vertical can't just belong to a distant hill. It has to be much closer than that. And that is where this stops being a church phrase hanging in the air and starts getting uncomfortably close to your own skin. Look at the form itself for a moment. Not the sermons around it, not the stained glass version, just the shape. One line runs upright, one runs across. If you stand still and spread your arms, you already know this with your eyes before anybody explains it. The head rests above the meeting point. The feet root below it. The reach goes outward to either side. The sign and the human frame answer each other in a way that is almost too plain once you see it. Sit with that. The cross you were told to take up may have been in front of you all along in the architecture of your own body. And I mean that carefully. I'm not trying to turn the whole gospel into a sketch on paper. I am saying the image fits you so tightly that it deserves your attention. The upright line has a living counterpart in you. The wide beam has one too. That is why the language of lifting begins to matter in a new way, because the thing being lifted may not be an object in your hands at all. This is also where some people get nervous, and I understand it. The moment you say the human form and the sacred sign mirror each other, it can sound like somebody is playing a word game. But the old religious imagination has always worked through body, gesture, posture, bread, water, breath, kneeling, standing. The body was never absent from meaning. It was carrying meaning the whole time. And if this form belongs this closely to you, then take up your cross becomes a stranger command than most of us were taught. Stranger and more intimate. Because then the question is no longer, what misery do I drag behind me? It becomes, where is the living beam in me? And what exactly rises on it? And right here, before we go any further, you should push back a little. Because the honest objection is sitting there in plain view. You could say, fine, the body echoes the shape. But the cross was still an instrument of public cruelty. Wood, exposure, fear, shame. Aren't you dressing up something harsh and turning it into a private symbol? That is a fair objection. It deserves a straight answer. Yes, Rome used that form that way. No one needs to pretend otherwise. The rough timber, the open sky, the awful public stare, all of that belongs to the history of it. But history has layers, and this is where people often stop too early. Rome did not invent the shape itself. The crossing of an upright and a beam was already old before empire used it for terror. That meeting of lines had been seen, traced, carved, and pondered long before it was turned into a state tool. Sit with that. It means the form had a life before humiliation was nailed onto it. And if a symbol existed before it was weaponized, then its meaning cannot be reduced to the ugliest moment in its story. That matters spiritually, because a lot of people have inherited the cross only at its darkest register. They hear the word and feel dread in the stomach, pressure in the throat, a kind of sacred heaviness. But the older form keeps asking a different question. What if the sign was pointing to structure before it was pointing to suffering? Once you allow that possibility, even a little, the whole field opens. Scripture shows the upward motion. Your own frame gives you the shape. And then, from outside church language altogether, another witness steps forward. A philosopher, centuries before the gospel accounts, describing the soul of the world itself with crossed bands, as though this pattern was woven deeper into reality than most people ever imagined. And when you hear who that was, the room gets very quiet. That witness is Plato. Long before church language formed around this sign, Plato, in the Timaeus, describes the soul of the world with two bands crossed in the form of the Greek letter chi. You do not need a philosophy degree for that to land. Just hear the image. two great lines crossing through a center point, holding order together, a pattern of meeting, balance, and relation. When you hear that beside the old sacred symbol, something stirs. The shape you thought belonged only to one moment in religious memory starts to look older, wider, almost woven into the way human beings have tried to picture reality itself. Now, I want to be careful here. I am not saying Plato was secretly preaching the gospel before the gospel. That would be cheap. I am saying he saw a crossed structure at the level of the world soul, and that matters because it means this form was already carrying metaphysical weight long before it was carrying Christian language. The sign had depth before it had doctrine wrapped around it. Sit with that. And once that enters the room, the cross stops feeling like a small instruction about private misery. It starts sounding like an invitation to align yourself with a deeper pattern. That is why Matthew begins with that inner surrender. Deny himself. If the grasping self is all you know, you cannot feel any of this. You will drag the phrase down into anxiety and call that obedience. But if you deny the lower self, even for a moment, the whole symbol opens. It becomes vertical, ordered, alive. There is something beautiful in that, and also unsettling. Because if scripture points upward and Plato sees a crossed order in the world soul, then the question gets sharper. Where does ordinary human culture place this same form? Not just in words, and not just in prayer, but in the way people have pictured the human being itself. And that next clue has been hanging in plain sight for centuries. Arms spread wide. That clue is sitting in the history of art. And once you notice it, you cannot really unsee it. Think of those old drawings of the human figure with the arms stretched wide, the chest open, the body measured from center to edge as though proportion itself were speaking through flesh. In the Vitruvian tradition, the opened body becomes a template, not a random pose, a standard, a measure. The human form, extended across height and width, is treated as something ordered enough to guide architecture, design, balance. You can almost picture the dry paper, the dark lines, the careful hand marking span and length. And there it is again, the same meeting of upright and a cross. Now, to be fair, those artists were not preaching a sermon about take up your cross. They were not sneaking a hidden altar into anatomy lessons. We do not need to force that. But we do need to notice what they kept returning to. When the body is shown in fullness, when it is opened and measured, it falls into that familiar structure. Height, breadth, center, extension. The form itself carries an old dignity. Sit with that. So now you have three witnesses in the room. Scripture has the upward language. Plato gives the crossed order of the world soul. The Vitruvian body shows the human frame opened as proportion. None of them alone would be enough to build a whole claim. Together, they start pressing on you from different sides. They make the symbol harder to dismiss as only one historical object from one terrible scene. And here is where it starts getting personal again. If this sign keeps showing up in text, in thought, in art, then maybe it is not asking first to be admired. Maybe it is asking to be located. In you. In the living structure you are already moving around in every day, often without ever feeling it. Because the moment you stop looking at the outline and start asking what the inner post actually is, your own body answers before theology does. And it answers from the middle of your back. That answer is more physical than most people expect. Run your hand, even just in your mind, from the base of your back upward. Bone by bone, that central column rises through you like a quiet staff under the skin. That is the upright spine. Inside that long groove sits the spinal cord, the deep running line through which so much of your sensation and movement are carried. Then, from that center, pathways branch outward, into the shoulders, down the arms, across the frame. The old sign is no longer just an outline hanging on a wall. It begins to look like a lived structure. And this is where the words take up start sounding different again. Because if the upright line of the cross has a living correspondence in you, then lifting it is not about picking up a heavy object in front of your chest. It points to attention, posture, orientation. It points to the fact that your life has a vertical axis. One part of you sinks, curls, tightens, grabs. Another part can rise, open, steady itself. You have felt both, even if you never used religious language for them. You know the sag of defeat. You know the slight clearing that comes when you straighten without force and something in you becomes more awake. Sit with that. I also want to be honest here, because this can sound slippery if nobody says it plainly. I am not giving you a medical lecture disguised as theology. Nor am I saying nerves and bones are secretly a sermon in a lab coat. I am saying the body can be read symbolically, and when you read it that way, this form becomes startlingly intimate. The vertical post corresponds to the spine and spinal cord. The horizontal spread corresponds to the arms and branching nerves. The sign is not far away from you. You are already inhabiting its pattern. And once that lands, another old line starts to glow from the inside. Your body is a temple. If that is true, then the central beam of this temple is no decoration. It is the place where attention is meant to rise. And once that temple image settles in, the old command starts sounding far more precise. If your body is a temple, then the central line of it is not just anatomy to be ignored while your thoughts run wild overhead. It is the inner place where direction happens. That is why the order in Matthew matters so much. Deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Hear the sequence again, slowly. First, deny that lower self. First, loosen the part that clenches, narrates, panics, reaches for control. Then take up. Then follow. The movement is almost physical once you hear it clearly, because you cannot follow anything higher while the noisy operator in you is gripping every lever. Sit with that. This is where a lot of sincere people get trapped. They hear the word deny and think it means despise yourself, flatten yourself, erase your humanity. But that is too crude for the verse. The self being denied is the one that keeps collapsing inward around fear and appetite. The one that lives low and reacts fast. The instruction is about releasing its rule. And the moment that rule softens, even a little, something else in you has room to stand up. That is the hidden mercy in the command. The cross, in this reading, becomes the place where inward posture changes. The lower impulse is set down. Attention begins to gather. The center line becomes available. You do not have to manufacture holiness out of pain. You have to become available to assent. That is a very different spiritual life. It feels cleaner, brighter, less like dragging chains through mud, more like hearing a note in yourself you had forgotten was there. And here is the part that makes this more than a beautiful idea. The whole thing can be tested, quietly, in your own room, with your breathing, your posture, and a few minutes of honest attention. Because if this command was meant to be lived daily, then there has to be a way to practice it with the body you are already in. And that way begins with something so simple, most people miss it. You do not start by trying to feel profound. You do not start by chasing visions or forcing emotion. You begin where the command itself begins, with willingness. A chair under you, the faint sound of the room settling, air moving at the tip of your nose, the body you already have. If this form is lived through your own structure, then practice has to be plain enough to enter on an ordinary evening, while the dishes are drying in the next room and your thoughts are still noisy. That is where take up becomes concrete. It has to do with how you sit, how you let the center line come clear, how you stop pouring all your attention into the horizontal pull of the day, the calls, the errands, the old arguments, the mind jumping branch to branch. For a few minutes, you lift the vertical. You allow the inner line to matter more than the scatter. That alone begins to change the feeling of the phrase. The cross is no longer just an idea you agree with. It becomes a posture you inhabit. Sit with that. And this is also why follow me comes last in Matthew. If your attention is still being yanked around by the lower machinery of fear and habit, what exactly is doing the following? Just panic in religious clothing, just restlessness quoting scripture. But when you refuse the lower self, even briefly, there is space for another kind of guidance to register. Quieter, cleaner, less dramatic than people imagine, but more real. You may have tasted this without naming it. That tiny moment when you straighten a little and your breathing softens and some inner static drops away. Nothing flashy happens. Still, the room feels different. Your own mind sounds less crowded. A subtle upwardness appears, almost like a candle flame holding steady after a draft passes. That is the doorway. And in the final step, I want to show you exactly how to enter it tonight, with the body, the breath, and the living beam you have been sitting in all along. So here's the practice. Sit in a chair where your feet can rest flat. Feel the seat under your weight, the cloth at your shoulders, the quiet pressure of the floor under your heels. Let the hands rest easily. Then let the upright spine come awake. Not stiff, not military, just clear, as though a line through the center of you remembered itself. Give that a breath or two. Nothing fancy, nothing strained. Now breathe a little slower. As the breath moves, notice how quickly the mind wants to scatter sideways into old conversations, errands, fear, rehearsed answers. That is the moment to deny the lower self. You do not wrestle it. You do not curse it. You simply stop handing it the room. Each slow inhale, feel attention gather at the center. Each easy exhale, let the jaw loosen, the chest soften, the face unhook. Then, very gently, let your awareness travel upward through that inner line, as if a lamp were being raised, one small notch at a time inside a dark stairwell. Sit with that. This is how the phrase changes in the body. The cross is no longer the name of the thing that ruined your week. It becomes the place where you stop collapsing. In that quiet posture, Matthew's order stops being fury. First, the grasping voice steps back. Then the inner line clears. Then a kind of following begins that feels less like force and more like hearing. You may only catch it for a few seconds the first time. That is enough. A window cracked open still changes the air in the room. And then, after a minute or 5, you stand up. The sink is still there. The messages still wait. The house still makes its ordinary little sounds. But something has been set in place. The lamp in the stairwell is higher than it was. The room has not become holier by growing heavier. It has become quieter by standing straight.